The crisp Roman air, usually so vibrant with the clamor of a living city, takes on a different quality within the confines of the Vatican graveyard. Here, among the weathered marble and the solemn, moss-kissed angels, it whispers a perpetual requiem. When I first arrived, seeking refuge from the relentless clamor of modern scholarship and the sterile confines of university archives, I believed I had found a sanctuary. My project was innocuous enough, a detailed philological study of the obscure Latin epitaphs adorning centuries-old tombs, specifically those of minor ecclesiastics and overlooked cardinals. The peace was palpable, a balm to my weary mind, and the scent of ancient earth mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of incense that drifted from St. Peter's. Each sunset painted the statuary in hues of sorrow and grace, and I, notebook in hand, felt an almost spiritual connection to the quiet dignity of the past. I felt safe. I felt, for a fleeting time, as if I belonged. It was during one of these solitary twilight excursions, long after the last tourist had been ushered out and the heavy bronze gates clanged shut, that it began. I was meticulously transcribing a particularly faded inscription on a tomb marked simply P. Lucian, AD 1489, the stone cool beneath my fingertips. The air was still, the kind of absolute stillness that amplifies the smallest sound. Then a sound emerged from the very fabric of that stillness. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the distant call of a nightingale. It was a murmur barely audible, a faint sibilance that seemed to emanate directly from the ground beneath my feet, from the soil itself. A shiver, not of cold, but of something far more unsettling, traced a path down my spine. I paused, pen hovering over parchment my breath held. And then I heard it again, clearer this time, a breathy, drawn-out syllable, distinctly human, unmistakably a name. My own name. My first thought, of course, was exhaustion. Weeks of late nights, squinting at microfiche and deciphering archaic scripts, had taken their toll. My mind, I reasoned, was simply playing tricks on me, conjuring phantoms from the encroaching shadows. I laughed, a nervous, hollow sound that seemed to shatter the profound quietude. I even spoke aloud. A trick of the wind, old friend, to the silent, stone Lucian. But the wind was utterly still. And then it came a third time, stronger, more insistent, a voice that was both ancient and intimately familiar, a voice that crawled from beneath the grass and stone and whispered my name with an unnerving tenderness that bordered on demand. That was the moment. That was the point of no return. I should have stopped then. I should have gathered my things, locked the gates behind me, and never looked back. But the scholar's curse, that insatiable hunger for understanding, held me captive. What does a holy ground confess when no one's supposed to hear? I had to know. Over the next few nights I returned, drawn by a morbid curiosity that superseded all rational thought. I would sit near the tomb of P. Lucian, sometimes for hours, wrapped in the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, waiting. The whispers became more frequent, more articulate. They were not always my name now. Sometimes they were fragmented Latin phrases, archaic and unfamiliar, echoing like faint memory from centuries past. Non-licit, sire, they would sigh. Non-licit, sire. It is not permitted to know. A warning, perhaps, or a taunt. I began to write them down, feverishly, on the back of my research notes, the ink bleeding slightly in the damp, chill air. The parchment felt heavy, imbued with some arcane significance, as if merely capturing these sounds on paper gave them greater weight, greater reality. My research shifted. No longer content with epitaphs, I dove into the more obscure corners of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, seeking parallels for the strange phrases I was hearing. I accessed codices usually reserved for specialists, requesting scrolls and books with dusty, unbroken seals. I felt a growing sense of unease, a pervasive paranoia that settled into my bones like damp, cold marble. Were other scholars aware of this? Had others heard the graveyard speak? Or was I truly alone in this macabre conversation? I started avoiding colleagues, my eyes darting suspiciously at anyone who met my gaze for too long. The benign, academic pursuit I had started was transforming into something clandestine, something furtive. I soon stumbled upon references to certain forbidden texts, volumes supposedly expunged from the official church records centuries ago, works of esoteric theology and pre-Christian mysticism that hinted at the manipulation of sacred sites for profane ends. Texts that spoke of chthonic resonance and telluric currents, terms that made the hairs on my arms stand on end when I considered the deep, rich soil of the graveyard. One passage, written in a cramped, almost illegible hand, spoke of the living earth, a grand repository, not merely of bone and dust, but of memory, of intent, and of names that hold sway over the veil between worlds. It described specific rituals, whispered invocations, and the precise times when the barrier thins, usually at the liminal hours of dawn and dusk, or on specific lunar cycles. The whispers, I realized with a sickening jolt, were not random. They were deliberate. The phrases became clearer, no longer fragmented but forming cohesive, if terrifying, sentences. They spoke of pacts, of ancient guardians, of something buried beneath the very heart of the Vatican itself, something far older and more powerful than any saint or pope. They spoke of the true purpose of the hallowed ground, not as a resting place, but as a binding. And they spoke of my connection to it, how my presence, my name, was somehow activating this buried sentience. I should have stopped when my dreams became vivid nightmares, filled with the stench of upturned earth and the sound of muffled screams. I should have stopped when I found myself whispering the Latin phrases I'd heard in my sleep, my tongue tasting of ash and old dirt. But I kept listening, I kept reading. The forbidden books became my gospel, their dark prophecies my daily bread. I thought I was simply gathering information, dissecting an unusual phenomenon, but I was wrong. I was being inducted. The soil wasn't just whispering to me, it was whispering through me. My mind, once a citadel of logic and reason, was becoming a conduit. The subtle changes started small. I found myself craving the cold, damp air of the graveyard, feeling a growing aversion to sunlight and human company. My skin felt perpetually gritty, as if I too were slowly turning to earth. One night, emboldened by a perverse courage born of exhaustion and a terrifying clarity, I performed a small ritual described in one of the texts, a simple invocation, a tracing of symbols in the dirt, uttering one of the forgotten names the ground had given me. It was meant to be an experiment, a scholar's foray into the esoteric. But as the final syllable left my lips, the ground beneath me didn't just whisper, it groaned. The very earth convulsed, a low, guttural vibration that shook the marble angels on their pedestals, sending dust scattering from their wings. From deep, deep beneath, something shifted, something vast and ancient. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and the scent of incense was replaced by the cloying odor of rot and something metallic, like old blood. The grave around me seemed to hold their breath, or perhaps, for the first time, exhale. I had opened a door, not just to knowledge, but to something far more fundamental, far more hungry. I'm not sure how I escaped that night. The memory is fragmented like shattered glass, but I remember running, the ground grasping at my feet, the whispers now a roaring chorus of demands and forgotten names echoing in my skull. I remember the feeling of being pursued, even though no physical entity followed me. The dread wasn't in my shadow, it was in my very substance. I learned then that some names are not meant to be spoken, some grounds are not meant to be disturbed, and some knowledge, once acquired, can never be shed. I know now I am merely an echo of who I once was, a repository of secrets I was never meant to hold. The instructions were so deceptively simple, uttered with that casual, dismissive tone of someone who has long since forgotten the weight of their own words. The rules of custody, Bishop Valerius had intoned, his gaze drifting over my shoulder to some distant, unseen point, are paramount. Every caretaker must memorize them. Their observance is the bedrock of our stewardship. He tapped a manicured finger against his desk, a gesture of finality that implied the task was as straightforward as committing a shopping list to memory. I, in my naive academic zeal, saw it as a challenge, an initiation into the deeper, more arcane lore of the Vatican's hidden archives. I imagined dusty tomes, perhaps a scroll or two, carefully preserved under glass, not this, never this. The actual location of these rules was, of course, never specified in any of the orientation materials, nor was it mentioned in the whispered histories I'd spent months collecting. It was a secret kept with malicious intent, designed to ensnare the curious, the diligent, the foolish. And I, in my pursuit of what I believed was profound historical truth, was precisely that. My first few weeks were a blur of meticulously cataloguing the more mundane artifacts of the old abbey, a place so remote and forgotten that even the Vatican's most stringent archivists rarely visited. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and cold stone, a mausoleum of forgotten faith. I spent my days dutifully recording inventories, cross-referencing spurious saintly relics, and trying to decipher monastic shorthand that predated the printing press. It was tedious, solitary work, but it also afforded me an unparalleled freedom to explore. The main chapel, long deconsecrated but still humming with a faint, residual spiritual energy, drew me often. Its altar, a massive slab of porphyry, felt strangely inert, too heavy, too solid almost. Sealed. My intuition, that persistent, nagging voice I've learned to trust and now utterly despise, told me there was something more to it. There was always something more, in these forgotten places. One frigid evening, a draught caught a loose tapestry behind the altar, revealing not a bare stone wall, but a cleverly disguised seam. It was a faint line, almost invisible to the casual observer, running horizontally across what appeared to be solid rock. My heart, still beating with the rhythm of a man who believed in logical explanations, quickened with the thrill of a discovery. I traced the seam with a gloved finger, feeling a subtle unevenness. A faint, almost imperceptible click, and a section of the wall slid inward, revealing a small, dark recess. The air that rushed out was ancient, dry, and carried a faint, coppery scent, iron perhaps, or something far more disturbing. Within, shrouded in what felt like centuries of undisturbed shadow, lay a shallow niche. And in that niche, nestled on a cushion of desiccated velvet, was the skull. Not a human skull, not entirely. It was too elongated, too perfectly smooth, with an unnerving, almost unnatural density. It gleamed faintly in the beam of my penlight, a sickly, pearlescent white, stark against the dark recess. And then I saw them, carved into the bone itself, an intricate lacework of script. Tiny, elegant Latin characters, etched with such precision that they looked less like carvings and more like veins pulsating beneath the surface. It was a language I knew intimately, but rendered in a terrifyingly unfamiliar medium. As my light played over the surface, a faint shimmer, a dark crimson hue, seemed to coalesce within the grooves of the lettering. It wasn't paint, nor dried residue. It was fluid. It bled. I hesitated then, my breath catching in my throat, a premonition colder than the tomb itself washing over me. This was no ordinary historical document. This was a covenant, a warning, a trap. But the academic in me, the part that craved forbidden knowledge, that believed understanding was armor, was already too far gone. I had to know. I reached out a trembling finger, my glove providing no true barrier to the icy cold of the bone, and traced the first rule. The Latin characters felt slick beneath my fingertip, not with moisture, but with a subtle internal tremor that resonated deep within the bone itself. Voca nomen, et portere periata. Call the name, and the gate shall be opened. The words, simple yet utterly terrifying in their context, resonated with an unholy power. And as the last syllable formed in my mind, a subtle shift occurred. Wasn't loud, not a crash or a groan, but a distinct, almost imperceptible displacement of air behind me. A deeper darkness seemed to settle in the corners of the chapel, the shadows lengthening and deepening as if drawing breath. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing. Only the familiar, comforting silhouettes of the empty pews, the faint glint of the altar cross. I told myself it was the old building settling, the air currents shifting, my own paranoia manifesting. But the chill that ran down my spine was not from the cold stone. It was from the absolute, chilling certainty that something had responded. I should have stopped then. I should have resealed the niche, left the skull to its centuries of undisturbed slumber, and walked away. I tell myself this now, every waking moment, every nightmare-haunted sleep. But the lure of the unknown, the intellectual hunger to understand what I had stumbled upon, was too potent. It was an addiction, a thirst for the secrets that the Vatican had so assiduously guarded for millennia. My hand, as if guided by an unseen force, returned to the skull. and as my finger brushed the first etched word again, a low thrum began. It was not a vibration that I felt with my hand alone, but one that resonated in my chest, my teeth, the very marrow of my bones. It was a deep, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the skull itself, but from within it, from the very air it disturbed. The thrum intensified, rising in pitch, an ancient, sonorous tone that permeated the chapel. It wasn't music, not in any conventional sense, yet it possessed a harmonic complexity that was utterly alien. And then the horrifying realization struck me. It sounded like prayer. Not the fervent, desperate pleas of the faithful, but the dark, guttural intonations of a forgotten liturgy, a chant of immense power and malevolent intent. It was the sound of something being called, being woken, being invited. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, began to splinter. Vatican conspiracies, forbidden books, names that summon, all the whispered fears I dismissed as myth began to coalesce into a chilling, undeniable reality. The very air grew heavy, thick with an almost palpable presence, and the shadows around me seemed to writhe, not with movement, but with a living, consuming hunger. My own breath hitched, a desperate, shallow gasp as the thrum reached a crescendo, a silent scream building in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the skull, the letters still bleeding, the bones still humming with that unholy, ritualistic song. I had merely traced the first rule, but already the gate had begun to open, and I was on the threshold, caught between the world I knew and a reality far older, far darker, and irrevocably awake. And now the hum is inside me, a constant, dreadful melody, getting them to my hiding place. I remember Father Dominico's hands, not his face, which was a mask of fear, but his hands. They trembled like autumn leaves in a hurricane, not with age, but with a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate through the very air around him. He spoke of the bells of St. Pietro, of their iron tongues that should only ever be moved by mortal hands, by human will. They don't ring on their own, he'd rasped, his eyes darting to the stained glass window of his small study, as if expecting the ancient stone to give way and reveal the very thing he feared. His words, delivered in hushed, almost conspiratorial tones, were the first crack in the carefully constructed facade of my academic world, the initial tremor that presaged the collapse of everything I thought I knew. I should have stopped then, should have dismissed his rambling as the ravings of a man losing his grip. But I didn't. I listened. I always listen. The forbidden texts had become my singular obsession. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Vatican's auxiliary archives, behind a false wall marked only by a faint, almost invisible sigil etched into the plaster, they were not merely old books. They were repositories of a virulent truth. These were not the sanctified scrolls or theological treatises I had spent my life studying. These were the condemned, the excised, the whispered about grimoires and heretical codices that the Church had spent centuries burying, not preserving. I found them not by accident, but by following a trail of fragmented clues hidden within the margins of sanctioned texts. A misplaced colophon here, a cryptic citation there, like breadcrumbs leading to the gallows. The air in that hidden alcove was thick with a scent I can only describe as aged dread, a blend of decaying parchment, metallic dust, and something else, something cloying and ancient, like earth that has held too many secrets. One particular tome, bound in what felt disturbingly like human skin, drew my gaze with an almost magnetic pull. Its pages were not paper, but vellum, thick and unnervingly supple, covered in a script that writhed and coiled like a nest of vipers. It was Latin, yes, but twisted, infused with words and characters I had never encountered, not even in the deepest recesses of paleographic study. Nomina obscura, I later understood, the dark names, and verba vetita, the forbidden words. I thought I was immune, insulated by my academic detachment, by the cool logic of scholarly inquiry. I was merely translating, transcribing, cataloguing. I told myself I was an observer, a chronicler, not a participant. But the more I read, the more the words seeped into me, changing the very frequency of my thoughts. The text spoke of the veil, of what lay just beyond the perceived reality, of the ancient compacts and the slumbering entities that underpinned our world. It hinted at rituals, at specific times and places, at the confluence of stellar alignments and earthly cycles that could thin the membrane between here and elsewhere. As midnight approached, the library's silence became a palpable entity, pressing in from all sides. The streetlights outside cast long, skeletal shadows of the ancient olive trees across the high windows, making them dance like spectres in my peripheral vision. I was hunched over the accursed tome, tracing a particularly complex passage with a trembling finger. It detailed a specific invocation, a rare conjunction of elements and forces, culminating in a precise sonic resonance, a sound that, when enacted at a certain hour under certain conditions, could stir what should remain undisturbed. And then I read the chilling addendum, scrawled in a different hand, a desperate warning in the margin. See tintinnabula post medium noctum sonant, ni respices sepulchra. If the bells ring after midnight, don't look at the grave. A profound chill gripped me, not from the draft, but from the realization. Father Domnico's words, the shaking hands, the bells. I glanced at my watch. 11:58 p.m. My breath caught in my throat. I should have closed the book, should have run, should have ripped out the pages and burned them into oblivion. But the morbid curiosity, the scholar's insatiable hunger for truth, held me captive. I kept reading, my eyes devouring the final lines, the sequence, the specific number of tolls. 12. Slow, deliberate, wrong. The first clang ripped through the night, a discordant heavy thrum that vibrated through the stone floor and into my bones. It was not the usual joyful peal of St. Pietro, nor the frantic toll of alarm. This was something else entirely, a sound laden with immense, ancient sorrow, a profound emptiness that seemed to drain the air of oxygen. Dong. I counted, my heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a frantic, panicked drum. Dong. 11 more to go. The sound was too heavy, too resonant for mere bronze. It was as if the earth itself was ringing. With each agonizing dong, the very fabric of my perception began to fray. I heard the second, then the third, and the library seemed to darken, not from the fading lamplight, but from an oppressive, encroaching gloom that swallowed the already dim corners. By the fifth toll, a low rumble started beneath my feet, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that quickly escalated into a deep, guttural groan. The building itself seemed to sigh, the ancient stones settling, or perhaps unsettling. My eyes were fixed on the forbidden text, but my body screamed for me to look up, to peer out the window, to confirm the dreadful implication. The sixth, seventh, and eighth tolls brought with them a profound sense of pressure, as if the entire weight of the world was pressing down on my chest. The groaning from beneath became more pronounced, a viscous, churning sound, like something immense awakening from a long, troubled sleep. My mind screamed at me, "Don't look at the grave." I repeated it like a mantra, my gaze glued to the parchment, to the swirling, inky script. But my peripheral vision betrayed me. Through the high, arched windows that overlooked the cathedral's cemetery, I saw it. The ground was not just rumbling, it was swelling. Slowly, deliberately, the earth over the ancient grave began to rise, not uniformly, but in undulating mounds, like a slow, deep breath. It was as if the vast, silent necropolis was inhaling, preparing to expel something. The shadows cast by the trees, once still, now elongated and writhed with a sinister life of their own, no longer mere absences of light, but active, discerning entities. They stretched, they recoiled, they seemed to reach. And I could feel their collective gaze. The ninth, 10th, and 11th bells were a blur of terror, each clang a hammer blow to my sanity. The swelling became more pronounced, a palpable distension of the earth, cracking the ancient headstones and pushing them aside like insignificant pebbles. What was beneath was immense, and it was moving. The final, 12th dong resonated for an eternity, leaving an echoing vacuum in its wake. In that suffocating silence, the only sound was the sickening churn of the earth, the soft, fleshy displacement of soil and stone, and my own ragged, choking breath. I kept my eyes fixed on the tome, on the cursed words that had brought this nightmare to life, but the shadows were already there. They had seen me first. The words had not merely been translated, they had been activated. I had not merely read, I had summoned. And now the veil was not just thin, it was rent. The dread was not just a feeling, it was a living, breathing thing, aware of my presence, drawn to the breach I had foolishly opened. I was no longer an observer, I was the bait. And the silence after the final bell was not empty, it was full of a waiting. The chill that settles into the bones of a mortician isn't just from the refrigerated air of the preparation room, it's a deeper, more pervasive cold, born from proximity to finality. I've known that chill intimately for years, a constant companion in my profession. It was a familiar, almost comforting sensation until the night the call came about Matteo. No last name, just Matteo. A man of no family, no friends, no mourners, the kind of anonymous end that often drifts through our care, destined for the quiet, forgotten corners of the cemetery. The fee was generous, unusually so, for such a minimal request. A late-night burial, no service, just the interment. I attributed the strangeness to the eccentricities of whatever obscure fund was handling his affairs, convincing myself that some souls prefer to slip away without fanfare, leaving no ripple on the surface of the world. I should have recognized the first whisper of an ill wind then, the unsettling feeling that something was already profoundly out of alignment. The registry, meticulously maintained in my office, confirmed it. Matteo, age unknown, cause of death listed as natural causes, signed by a doctor whose script was an illegible scrawl, a hasty flourish that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. The coffin arrived in the dead of night, carried by two silent men in dark, nondescript suits, their faces shadowed by the brim of their hats, their movements economical and devoid of any human warmth. They didn't speak, didn't meet my gaze, merely deposited the plain pine box on the waiting dolly and vanished into the night as silently as they had appeared. My instincts screamed at me. This wasn't just unusual, it felt orchestrated, a performance of anonymity. But the financial incentive, coupled with a lifetime of conditioning to accept the bizarre in the realm of the dead, overrode my mounting unease. I simply signed the receipt, the paper feeling cold and brittle beneath my pen, a contract not just for a burial, but for something far more sinister. Alone in the sterile quiet of the chapel, beneath the anemic glow of the emergency lights, I prepared for the viewing. The lid creaked open, exhaling a faint, earthy scent that was not quite the smell of a crypt, nor the sweetness of decay, but something else entirely, something ancient and dry. The man inside bore no resemblance to any Matteo I could conjure, no image that would fit a common, unassuming name. His skin was too pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over sharp, unyielding bone. His eyes, though closed, seemed to press inward, as if refusing to meet any light, even the artificial one above him. But it was his mouth that truly seized me, stopped my breath in my throat. It was not merely closed, but carefully, meticulously stitched shut with thick, dark thread, a crude, yet deliberate tapestry of silence. And beneath those stitches, just beneath the papery skin, I saw it. A faint, rhythmic pulse, a slow, almost imperceptible throb, like a second heart beating a fractured rhythm, not quite alive, not quite dead. My hand recoiled as if burned. Every fibre of my being screamed to stop, to call someone, to expose this grotesque tableau. But who? The faceless men who delivered him, the illegible doctor. The very air in the chapel felt thick with an unspoken threat, a suffocating implication that to question was to invite a fate worse than silence. My mind, usually so clear and methodical, fractured. Rationalizations warred with visceral terror. Perhaps it was a medical procedure gone horribly wrong, a desperate attempt to contain some grotesque illness, or a cultural custom I was ignorant of, though no such practice had ever graced my tables. Yet the pulsing. It defied all known biology, all understanding of death. It was a macabre living secret that I was now privy to, an unwilling accomplice in its perpetuation. I convinced myself that burying it, covering it with earth, was the only way to make it disappear, to reassert the natural order. It was a cowardly act, born of profound fear, disguised as duty. The burial itself was a blur, performed under the cold scrutiny of the moon, the only witness to my transgression. I worked with frantic energy, my shovel biting into the frozen earth, each thud echoing like a judgment in the vast emptiness of the graveyard. The weight of the coffin as I lowered it felt immense, not just physically, but morally. I mumbled a fragmented prayer, words that felt hollow and meaningless, a mockery of the sacred rites I usually performed with reverence. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domin. Grant him eternal rest, O Lord. But what kind of rest could be granted to something that pulsed beneath stitches, a thing that defied the very concept of rest? As the last clod of earth fell, muffling the faint thud of the coffin, I felt a tremor of relief, a desperate hope that by concealing it, I could forget it, could push the memory of that stitched mouth and that impossible pulse into the deepest recesses of my mind. The morning sun, usually a comforting presence after a night of grim work, felt accusatory as it streamed through my bedroom window. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was profoundly wrong. The dreamless sleep I had hoped for was replaced by a restless, fragmented night, haunted by the image of that taut, pale skin. An irrational compulsion seized me. I had to go back. I had to see the grave, ensure the earth had settled, confirm that my act of burial had indeed been final. The walk through the dewy grass to the quiet corner where Matteo was laid felt interminable, each step heavier than the last. And then I saw it. The grave was empty. Not disturbed, not excavated crudely, but utterly, unnervingly smooth, as if the earth had never been broken. The mound of soil I had piled was gone, the disturbed ground perfectly resettled. And there, beside the perfectly flat earth, stood the coffin, its lid ajar, perfectly dry, revealing its immaculate, chilling emptiness. A guttural cry tore from my throat, raw and desperate. This wasn't theft. No thief would bother to meticulously re-level the earth, to leave the coffin perfectly dry and empty. This was something else, something far more deliberate, far more terrifying. The air seemed to press in on me, the silence of the cemetery no longer peaceful, but predatory. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my initial shock. My hands trembled, my breath hitched. I scrambled to the edge of the empty space, peering down into the pristine soil. There were no marks, no footprints, no sign of struggle or forced entry. It was as if the earth itself had opened, swallowed its contents, and then sealed itself back, erasing all evidence of its momentary weakness. My mind reeled, trying to grasp at any rational explanation, but all I found was a gaping abyss of the impossible. Back in the quiet sanctuary of my office, my hands still shaking, I pulled open the registry again. The name, Matteo, stared back at me mocking, meaningless. This time my eyes fixated on the signature on the death certificate, the one I had dismissed as illegible. In the harsh light of day, with my sanity fraying, I saw it differently. Not an illegible scrawl, but a symbol, a stylized sigil woven into what masqueraded as a name. It was vaguely familiar, like a half-forgotten nightmare. My academic background, an old fascination with forgotten histories and obscure religious texts, stirred uneasily. I had seen such things before, tucked away in forbidden manuscripts, in illustrations accompanying treatises on demonology, or in the records of suppressed heretical cults. This wasn't a doctor's signature. This was a mark, a declaration. My fingers flew across the keyboard of my research terminal, navigating through encrypted databases, through the digitized archives of the Vatican's Librum Prohibitum, through ancient, digitized Gnostic texts and apocryphal gospels that had whispered of hidden orders and impossible rituals. The symbol, combined with the name Matteo, I found it. Not as a name, but as a designation, a placeholder. It was a reference to what they called corpus vacuus, the empty vessel, a concept I had always dismissed as mere allegory. The text spoke of entities, non-men, crafted not from flesh and blood, but from something primordial, something that pulsed with an imitation of life, sewn shut to contain the nascent awakening within. They were to be buried, but not to rest. Their interment was merely a phase, a necessary period of dormancy before they rose, not resurrected, but activated. The stitched mouth was a binding, the pulsing a slow, deliberate awakening. The knowledge I unearthed became a poison, seeping into every corner of my mind. I saw the symbol everywhere now, in the intricate carvings of old churches, in the shadowed patterns of tree branches, in the very cracks on my office wall. My sleep was no longer restless. It was absent. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside, became a whisper, a promise that it was coming, or perhaps that they were. I scrutinize every face, searching for that same unnatural pallor, that subtle rigidity, that unsettling silence. The people who delivered him, the obscure fund, the illegible signature, they were not isolated incidents. They were a network, a system, an unseen hand orchestrating the impossible, playing with forces that defied the very bedrock of our reality. I was no longer a simple mortician. I was an accidental participant, an unwitting witness to a ritual that stretched back into the darkest corners of forgotten history. The horror wasn't just that Matteo was gone or that the grave was empty. The true horror was the understanding that the burial itself was never meant to be a final act. It was a stage. The earth was a womb, the coffin a cradle, and the act of my labor, my sweat, my prayers, were merely components of a larger, unthinkable ritual. The pulsating beneath the stitches wasn't a dying heart. It was a nascent heart, growing stronger, preparing to burst forth. I hadn't buried a dead man. I had entombed something dormant, and my very act had released it, fulfilled its purpose. I had been a pawn in a game I didn't understand, and now the rules were changing, and I was exposed, marked by the dust of that empty grave, by the spectral pulse of a thing that was never meant to be alive. I realize now that the grave was empty because it was never truly a grave. It was a transition point. And I, the man who performed the rites, the one who touched the cold skin and packed the earth, I am now inextricably linked to it, a loose thread in their meticulous tapestry. I should never have buried a man who was never truly alive. The silence of the lower crypts is a peculiar thing. It isn't merely the absence of sound. It's a presence, a weight that settles in the bones, a cold hand on the back of the neck, even in the thickest wool vestment. My duties as a conservator, an archivist of the forgotten, often left me alone amidst the sarcophagi and the reliquaries, deciphering script, cataloguing artifacts that predated the very concept of the papacy. It was a monotonous existence, punctuated only by the occasional, hushed footsteps of the more senior clerics who descended into these depths for reasons they never specified, their faces always a little too blank, their gazes a little too distant. I accepted it, I suppose, because that's what one does when they serve something as ancient and as convoluted as the Holy See. There are always secrets, layers of knowledge, and a strict hierarchy of who is permitted to glimpse what. But there are also patterns, subtle deviations in the routine that, once noticed, cannot be unseen. My first inkling, a prickle of unease that grew into a persistent itch, came from observing the priests. Not all of them, mind you, only a select few from the inner circle, those whose names were whispered with a certain reverence, even fear. They would descend not in pairs, as was customary for nocturnal duties, but alone in the darkest hours before dawn, when the very stones of the Vatican seemed to exhale the sins of centuries. They never spoke of where they were going or why. Their path was always the same, past the crypt of the popes, down a lesser-used corridor filled with disused statuary, and into a section that, according to the official schematics, simply terminated in a solid rock wall. But I had seen them, not just once, but repeatedly. A shimmer in the oppressive gloom, a momentary distortion, and then they were gone. It was like watching a flaw in the fabric of reality, a tear in the otherwise meticulously maintained facade of order and sanctity. I should have stopped then, should have dismissed it as a trick of the light, the fatigue of endless nights spent poring over forbidden codices. But the human mind, especially one steeped in the mysteries of the sacred and the profane, abhors an unexplained anomaly. Curiosity, as they say, is a dangerous thing. It gnaws at the edges of reason, whispering promises of forbidden knowledge, of answers to questions you never even knew you had. My fascination turned into an obsession. I began to track their movements, noting the precise times, the phases of the moon, even the subtle shift in the air's humidity. And then, one night, after Father Anselm, a man whose eyes held a perpetual, ancient sorrow had vanished. I followed. Slowly, methodically, my lamp held low, casting grotesque shadows that danced like forgotten gargles. The corridor was colder than usual, the air thick with a scent I couldn't place, something metallic and sweet, like stale incense mixed with freshly spilled blood. The solid rock wall was not solid at all. It was a door, camouflaged with such exquisite artifice that it blended seamlessly with the rough-hewn stone, a triumph of ancient masonry, and I suspected, some form of preternatural concealment. It was not a door of wood or iron, but something far more disturbing. Ribs. Human ribs, or something disturbingly akin to them, intertwined with what appeared to be fossilized prayer beads, forming an intricate, ghastly lattice that gave way to a central panel. It pulsed faintly, a low, barely perceptible thrum against my fingertips as I traced its contours. It was a testament to a craft not of this world, a threshold between the known and the utterly unthinkable. Pushing it open was surprisingly easy, almost as if it had been waiting for me. A breath of icy air, dry and stale, escaped its maw. The passage beyond was narrow, a descending tunnel hewn into the living rock, slick with what I hoped was merely condensation. The further I descended, the more pronounced the smell became, not just metallic sweetness, but ozone and something else, something profoundly old and utterly unholy, like history itself decaying. And then the space opened up into a chamber far larger than anything I could have imagined. It was a chapel, yes, but one that mocked the very concept of sanctity. The walls were not adorned with frescoes of saints, but with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe, depicting scenes of unspeakable torment and esoteric rituals performed by figures with too many limbs and too few faces. And in the center, arranged in a chilling tableau, were the altars. Not fashioned from marble or gilded wood, but from bones. Thousands upon thousands of them, meticulously arranged, forming pedestals and plinths, each bone polished to a macabre sheen. And atop these skeletal altars, candles burned. Not the warm, comforting glow of beeswax, but an unsettling, frigid blue light that cast long, wavering shadows, making the entire chamber seem to exist in some infernal twilight. This was Rome. This was somewhere far older, far more terrible, a clandestine cathedral to a god the Vatican officially denied, even as its highest echelons worshipped in its shadows. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged gasp that echoed too loudly in the chilling quiet. I saw a figure then in the pews, or what passed for pews, rough benches also made of carved bone. He was facing away from me, perfectly still, his posture one of profound reverence or perhaps profound waiting. And he was wearing my uniform. Not a uniform like mine, but my uniform. The heavy woolen tunic, the precise cut of the collar, the specific wear on the elbow where I often leaned against the archival shelves. Even the small, almost imperceptible stain on the cuff from spilled ink that very morning. He was sitting there, a perfect replica, an echo, my own shadow given flesh and substance. A dreadful cold seeped into my very core, colder than the blue light, colder than the crypt itself. How long had he been there? How long had he been doing my job? Was he the one cataloguing the codices, sweeping the dust, polishing the reliquaries? Had he been walking these halls, a silent, unseen usurper, while I deluded myself into thinking I was alone in my duties? The thought that I might be sharing my life, my very existence, with this silent, uncanny double, crafted from ritual and shadow, began to unravel the carefully constructed tapestry of my sanity. I felt the names of ancient, forbidden entities, those whispered in the most blasphemous grimoires, rising unbidden to my lips: doppelganger liturgia, filius umbra, simulacrum animi, names that summon not just a presence, but an utter obliteration of the self. This was the work of the deeper, hidden church, the one that trafficked in such vile arts to maintain its terrestrial power, not through faith, but through unspeakable pacts. I didn't scream, I couldn't. The sound would have shattered not just the silence, but the fragile membrane of my own reality. I backed away, slow, deliberate steps, my eyes locked on the figure. He didn't move, didn't stir, yet I felt his gaze upon me, cold and knowing, as if he had anticipated my arrival, as if he was the one who had invited me. The blue candles pulsed, the bone altars seemed to hum with a latent energy. Every fibre of my being screamed to flee, but something held me captive, the sheer horror of the tableau, the profound, irreversible knowledge that had just been seared into my soul. I thought I was imagining it until I saw my own lamp's beam, the one I had left just inside the passage entrance, wavering. A subtle gust of air, a chilling sigh, as if the door was closing itself, gently, deliberately. I turned and fled then, scrambling back up the passage, not daring to look behind me, not daring to believe what I had seen. The door clicked shut with a soft, final sound, erasing the evidence of the chapel, but not the evidence in my mind. The blue light, the bones, the figure in my uniform, they are branded onto my retina, etched into my very consciousness. And now every shadow I cast seems a little too deep, a little too defined, as if waiting to detach itself from me and take its rightful place. Now every reflection I catch, in polished brass, in the obsidian pages of forbidden books, in my own sleepless eyes, holds a flicker of the blue light, a hint of the uncanny, the dread knowledge that somewhere, deep beneath the Vatican, my own replacement performs my duties, perfectly, silently, waiting for the day I falter. The third rule, they said, was the most sacred, yet the most easily transgressed. Never touch the holy water. I still hear the old sacristan's raspy voice, a sound like dry leaves skittering across cold flagstones, when he warned me. Not just any water, mind you, but the blessed aqua benedicta kept within the ancient baptismal font in the shadowed annex of the basilica. He spoke of its purity, its sanctity, a divine bulwark against the encroachments of the profane. But his eyes, roomy and distant, held a deeper fear, a fear that transcended mere spiritual reverence. He saw it not as protection, but as a bait, a trap, something exquisitely valuable that drew unwanted attention. I dismissed it then as the ramblings of a man whose faith had curdled into superstition, another quaint, forgotten edict in a place riddled with them. Oh, how I wish I had listened. How I wish I had understood that some rules aren't merely cautionary, but absolutely prohibitory, born from a terrible, witnessed necessity. It began subtly, as all profound horrors do. After every early morning mass, the level in the font seemed to dip more than usual. The priests, those pious, well-meaning custodians of the Lord's house, whispered amongst themselves. A sign, Father Michael would murmur, of the Lord's omnipresence perhaps, or a test of our faith. Father Benedetto, ever the pragmatist, blamed evaporation, the ancient stone absorbing it, or a faulty drain. But I knew better. I worked there. I catalogued the liturgical texts, painstakingly cross-referencing ancient manuscripts in the restricted archives, often late into the night. I saw the humidity levels, the sealed environment. The water wasn't evaporating. It was being consumed. The first time I truly noticed, I was passing the font on my way to the scriptorium, laden with scrolls I probably shouldn't have been carrying, documents hinting at forgotten rites and archaic supplications. My reflection, usually a wavering, distorted image in the dark water, shimmered. Not a ripple, not a tremor from my movement, but a faint internal vibration, as if the water itself was resonating. And then, there it was. My face, yes, but superimposed or perhaps underlaid by a dozen others. Not reflections of passers-by, the annex was empty. These were entities. Spectral visages, indistinct but unmistakably present, their mouths open, unhinged, like silent, starving fish. They were waiting. They were drinking. The cold sweat that slicked my palms then had nothing to do with the musty air of the basilica and everything to do with the absolute certainty that what I was seeing was real. The knowledge I was acquiring from the forbidden books in the Archivum Secretum, the true black books of the Vatican, not the carefully curated fictions presented to the public, began to coalesce into a chillingly coherent narrative. These texts, sealed for centuries, spoke of an ancient thirst, of entities that subsist not on blood or fear, but on belief, on sanctity, on the very essence of the divine. They catalogued names, dreadful appellations whispered only in the deepest shadows, of creatures that could traverse the liminal spaces between worlds, drawn to concentrated loci of spiritual power like moths to a flame. The holy water, a vessel of consecrated essence, was not just a symbol, it was a potent draught, a sustenance, a vital boundary, and something was breaching it. I should have walked away. I should have reported my findings, or failing that, simply ignored the insidious truth festering beneath the piety. But the obsessive curiosity that drives those of us who delve into the abyss of forbidden knowledge had already taken root. Each vanishing drop became a personal affront, a mystery I had to solve. The reflections grew clearer with each passing day, each depleted drop. Their eyes, deep voids, seemed to track me. Their mouths, gaping chasms, seemed to stretch wider, anticipating. I began to hear them too, or thought I did. A faint slurping sound, a wet, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate not from the font itself, but from the very air around it, a sound no human vocal cords could produce. My sleep became a fragmented tapestry of these sounds, these images, until the lines between waking and nightmare blurred into a continuous, suffocating dread. One evening after yet another evening mass, when the font looked visibly lower than it should have been, the temptation became unbearable. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape. The third rule echoed in my mind, but it was drowned out by the urgent, insatiable need to know. What was it? What were these reflections? What were they drinking? With a trembling hand, I reached out. My fingers, numb with a mix of terror and fascination, broke the surface. The water was colder than ice, yet somehow alive, vibrant. And then it bit me. Not a physical bite, not teeth, but a searing electric shock that coursed through my hand, up my arm, and into the very core of my being. It was a jolt of pure, distilled despair, 1,000 agonizing memories of thwarted hunger, of eons spent waiting, watching, thirsting. I ripped my hand back, a gasp tearing from my throat. A crimson wheal like a burn blossomed across my palm, throbbing with a phantom pain. But it wasn't just pain. It was a download, an imprint. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, I was them. I felt their endless, gnawing emptiness, their profound, cosmic starvation. I understood with a clarity that shattered my sanity what they were. They were the hungry dead, not spirits of men, but something far older, far more primordial, drawn to the radiant warmth of sanctity like parasites to a host. And the holy water. It was their nourishment, their most exquisite and painful indulgence. Each drop was a sacrament of paradox, a concentrated dose of the very divine essence they both craved and reviled. They were drinking it, yes, but it was a bitter draught, a constant reminder of what they had lost, what they could never truly possess. It was a taunt, a torture, and an addiction. And by touching it, by letting it bite me, I had not only broken the third rule, but I had shown them I was there. I had made myself visible. I had offered myself as a new, more potent source of sustenance. The bite wasn't just a warning, it was a taste. And now I can never unlearn the taste of their hunger, nor can I escape the gnawing awareness that they have tasted mine. If holy things can thirst, what are they truly thirsty for? Now I know, and the knowledge is a poison that seeps into my very bones. The tool shed always held a peculiar chill, even in the height of summer. It wasn't the kind of damp cold that suggested poor insulation. It was something deeper, a pervasive ancientness that permeated the very wood and rusted metal within. I'd always dismissed it as the musty breath of generations of forgotten tools and the ghosts of countless workdays. But now I know better. That shed was a vault, a liminal space, and I, a fool, walked right into its embrace, reaching for a simple rake only to brush against the true horror it guarded. Tucked away beneath a crumbling stack of yellowed seed catalogues, beneath a forgotten burlap sack that smelled of earth and something else, something metallic, like dried blood, I found it. A book. Not a book precisely, but a ledger. It wasn't bound in leather, not in any material I could readily identify. It felt like compressed human hide, slick and cold despite the dust, the pages brittle and thick, turning with the dry whisper of papyrus. The script within was Latin, not entirely, though there were familiar flourishes, faded ink that seemed to pulse faintly under my gaze. It was a language of symbols and angular, ancient glyphs, intertwined with names. Hundreds of them. Each page, meticulously pennied, listed a single name, followed by a series of coordinates, a date, and then, most unnervingly, a single, solitary word in a script that seemed to squirm on the page. Keeper. The paper, I swear, felt older than the Vatican itself, a relic from a time before popes and cardinals, before even the concept of organized religion as we know it. This was something primordial, a testament to an order so ancient. Its origins were lost in the deepest chasms of history. I should have stopped then. The scent of ozone, the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the ledger itself, the cold dread that slithered up my spine, they were all warnings. My mind, though, was a ravenous beast, clawing for knowledge, desperate to decipher the forbidden tapestry laid before me. I spent hours hunched in that shed, the light fading, my fingers tracing the alien characters. The coordinates, I slowly realized, corresponded to specific burial plots in this very cemetery. And the names. The names were of groundskeepers, every one of them. Generations of them, stretching back into a past that defied recorded history, each assigned to a single grave, their tenure, their purpose, etched in this monstrous tome. It was a roster, a chain of servitude stretching back to an epoch I couldn't comprehend, each living man a mere placeholder, a custodian for a specific plot of earth, for a specific occupant. My blood turned to ice as the realization hit me. This wasn't just a record. It was a testament, a decree. It implied a purpose beyond mere maintenance, a sacred, awful duty tied to the very essence of the ground beneath our feet. I thought of the countless hours I'd spent tending these grave, pulling weeds, mowing grass, never once questioning the deep, systemic order that seemed to govern this place. Now I saw it, stark and terrible, laid bare on these parchment pages. The cemetery wasn't just a place of rest. It was a living, breathing entity, and we, the groundskeepers, were its blood, its nervous system, its keepers of a grim secret. The weight of this esoteric knowledge pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I kept turning the pages, a sickening premonition gnawing at my gut. Don't look, don't look. But I couldn't stop. My eyes scanned each name, each plot, each keeper until, like a punch to the stomach, I saw it. My own name. Printed in the same impossibly ancient script, a stark, undeniable reality leaping out from the abyss of history. Beneath it, the coordinates for a burial plot, a specific date that felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. And then the single, squirming word, keeper. The air in the shed grew heavy, thick with something unseen, something ancient stirring, acknowledging my transgression. The plot number was one I'd never seen before, not on any map, not in any records I knew. It was an anomaly, a phantom grave in a place where I thought I knew every inch of consecrated earth. A cold, hard certainty settled in my chest. This plot was for me. Not for some distant ancestor, not for a future me, but for the present, living me. It was a preordained resting place, already assigned, already waiting. The dread was absolute, a chilling revelation that shattered my understanding of my own existence. How could something be assigned a grave when it hadn't died yet? The question screamed in my mind, a frantic, desperate plea for sanity in the face of the unspeakable. I left the ledger precisely where I found it, as if replacing it could somehow unsee what I had seen, unknow what I had learned. But the image of my name, the coordinates, the chilling designation of keeper for my own eventual grave, was seared into my mind. I stumbled out of the shed, the twilight air feeling colder, sharper, the familiar landscape of the cemetery transformed into a grotesque tableau of my inevitable fate. I couldn't shake the compulsion, the dreadful magnetic pull, to find that plot. My plot, to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know if it was real, if this ancient, blasphemous ledger spoke the truth. Under the sickly glow of a sliver of moon, I walked, my shovel slung over my shoulder out of habit, my heavy boots thudding softly on the dew-kissed grass. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered admonition. The air grew colder, the scent of damp earth mingled with something else, something acrid, like old blood and ozone. I followed the coordinates etched into my memory, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I moved through familiar paths, past markers I had tended for years, yet I felt utterly lost, a stranger in my own domain, driven by a terrible, relentless curiosity towards my own doom. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the older, forgotten sections of the cemetery, areas that were rarely visited, where overgrown ivy-choked ancient stones and cypress trees wept over forgotten souls. Then I saw it. Tucked away behind a crumbling mausoleum, almost entirely concealed by a thicket of thorny bushes, was a freshly dug plot. No headstone, no marker, just a neatly dug rectangle of dark, turned earth. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the place the ledger had assigned to me, a secret kept even from the groundskeepers themselves until the moment of reckoning. A new wave of terror washed over me, a physical nausea that made my knees weak. The plot wasn't just empty, it was open. The dark cavity gaped like a mouth, a maw waiting to swallow me whole. The horror wasn't just in the existence of my grave, but in its condition. It wasn't waiting for the day I'd be lowered into it. It was already accepting. It was a horrifying testament to a preordained fate, a life accounted for, a destiny set in stone long before I even drew breath. I took a shaky step closer, the air around the tomb feeling heavy, charged with a malevolent energy, a whisper of unseen eyes watching me. And then I saw the contents. My blood ran cold, freezing in my veins. Lying there, nestled in the dark earth as if awaiting my arrival, were items that were unmistakably mine. My shovel, the very one I was carrying, but somehow older, rusted and earth-caked, as if it had been buried for centuries. My work boots, worn and familiar, yet decayed, the leather cracked and brittle. And then, at the foot of the nascent tomb, gleaming sickly in the faint moonlight, were my teeth. Not just a few, but a full set, bone-white and unmistakable. My teeth. The very ones I felt behind my lips, cold and hard and very much a part of me, were lying in my own open grave. How could something be buried that hadn't died yet? The question was a frantic, maddening scream in my mind, a desperate attempt to grasp at reason in the face of the utterly unreasonable. It was a sacrilege, a blasphemy against the very order of life and death. This wasn't a premonition. It was an active prophecy, a chilling declaration that my future was not only sealed, but already enacted in some twisted, temporal paradox. The ledger, the plots, the keepers. It was all part of a dark, cosmic machination, a shadowy ritual playing out across generations, where the living were merely placeholders for their own eventual demise, custodians of their own predestined grave. I backed away slowly, my mind unraveling, the world tilting on its axis. The cemetery, once a place of somber solace, now felt like a predatory beast, its ancient heart beating beneath my feet. I was not just a groundskeeper. I was a marked man, chosen not by fate, but by an ancient, insidious force that predated even the concept of time. The ledger wasn't merely a record. It was a binding contract, signed in the blood of generations of keepers, and I, in my foolish curiosity, had just activated my clause. I am a groundskeeper, yes, but I am also a prisoner, a living ghost haunted by the chilling knowledge of my own burial, by the sight of my own remains waiting for me. The weight of this secret, this terrible truth, presses down on me, suffocating, relentless. I walk among the dead, but I am already one of them, merely marking time until the open maw of my own grave finally claims me. The words of the ledger echo in my mind, a constant, chilling refrain. Every grave has a keeper, and mine just woke up. And it's hungry. I should have left that shed unopened, that ledger untouched, because now every breath I take is a countdown to my own burial. I often ask myself in the dark, when the shadows stretch, and my own reflection looks like a stranger, how much of this could have been avoided. I should have stopped, truly stopped, when the first whispers of the Codex Animi began to bleed from the pages of Father Alistair's personal notes. I should have dismissed his frantic scrawls about iconostasis animata as the ramblings of a man broken by isolation, not a roadmap to a horror so fundamental it reweaves the very fabric of faith. But I kept reading, a perverse curiosity gnawing at the edges of my resolve, convincing myself that knowledge, however dark, was merely information. I was so utterly, catastrophically wrong. The information wasn't benign. It was a contagion, and I had opened the first vial. It started subtly, as these things always do, with the kind of atmospheric trickery your mind dismisses as fatigue or a trick of the light. The thick, persistent fog that had descended upon the old quarter of the city wasn't unusual for this time of year, but it lent an unnerving quality to everything. The cobblestones glistened with damp, and the ancient stone saints, perched in their niches above the narrow streets, seemed to loom larger, their carved features softened by the milky haze. I remembered walking past the statue of St. Jude, protector of lost causes, his traditionally stern, unyielding expression seeming almost tender. A trick of the light, I told myself. A trick of my weary mind, perhaps still buzzing from the obscure Latin passages I had spent the preceding night dissecting, passages that detailed an unsettling tradition of depositio animarum, a kind of spiritual transference, long suppressed by the Vatican, hinted at in the most esoteric texts of the Officium Defunctorum. But the feeling persisted. The next morning, passing the very same statue on my way to the archives, the fog still thick enough to make the world feel muffled and unreal, I paused. St. Jude's gaze, usually fixed upon some unseen point of celestial contemplation, felt different. It felt focused, almost personal. His lips, sculpted centuries ago into a thin, benevolent line, seemed fuller, softer. And in the subtle curve of his smile, I saw something that pricked at a deep, uncomfortable memory. It wasn't just a saint anymore. It was an expression, an echo of someone I knew. The chilling part was, I couldn't immediately place it. I shook my head, blamed my increasingly strained nerves, and hurried on. This was the precise moment I should have turned back, burned the books, and sought absolution. But the knowledge, you see, was already working its way into my blood. The horror solidified a week later. I was walking through the old cemetery, a place I once found peace in, tracing the faded epitaphs of generations long past. The fog was a constant companion now, a shroud over the living and the dead. And there they were, the angels, the cherubs, the sorrowful virgins, and the stoic saints adorning the grand mausoleums. My breath caught in my throat. The statue of St. Michael, poised mid-strike against a serpentine demon, no longer bore the generic, noble features of ancient stone. His brow was furrowed with a familiar weariness. His eyes held a specific depth of sorrow that haunted me. It was Father Thomas. Father Thomas, who had vanished 6 months ago after an impassioned sermon about the dangers of spiritual apathy. His kind, tired eyes, his unique melancholic set to his jaw, they were carved into St. Michael's face, unmistakably. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I started seeing them everywhere. The serene Madonna in the town square now wore the delicate, almost imperceptible scar above her left eyebrow that belonged to Sister Agnes, a nun who disappeared from the convent last spring after her increasingly fervent sermons on the sacred burdens of the living. The grim-faced St. Peter, clutching his keys outside the cathedral, had the unmistakable downturn of lips, the slight tremor in the chin of old Master Elias, the church sexton, who had simply ceased to appear for his duties one bitter winter morning. His family, resigned, had assumed he'd finally succumbed to the cold. But Elias was there, in the stone, his eyes following me as I walked past, a flicker of something desperate in their unblinking stare. This wasn't imagination. This was a desecration, a horrific transmigration. The Codex Animi spoke of it, in veiled warnings, in cryptic parables of the living stone and faith made manifest. I had dismissed it as metaphor. The text spoke of lapis loquentis, the speaking stone, and how, in times of great spiritual vacancy or profound, unconfessed sin within the clergy, the animus loci, the spirit of the sacred place, would seek new vessels. It spoke of faces borrowed, expressions made permanent, of a dark, forgotten ritual translatio vultus, where the essence of a soul, particularly one bound by oath or devotion, could be drawn into a consecrated effigy. The Church had declared these passages heretical, burning every known copy of the more explicit accounts. I understood why now. They weren't just protecting the faithful from dangerous ideas. They were burying a truth so monstrous it could unravel the very foundations of their power. They knew. They must have known. The Vatican's archives, I realized, weren't just repositories of knowledge. They were containments for horrors like this. I tried to pray, to find solace in the rituals that had once anchored me. I knelt in the silent, empty nave of the cathedral, the air heavy with incense and the unspoken pleas of centuries. I closed my eyes, mumbling the Paternoster, searching for the comforting rhythm of devotion. But as I reached the line, "Give us this day our daily bread," a chilling sound, faint but undeniable, reached my ears. A scraping like stone against stone echoed through the vast space. I opened my eyes. High above, nestled in their alcoves, the saints were watching. Not just watching, but their stony lips, now unmistakably human and familiar, were moving. They weren't speaking my words, no. Their mouths were twisting into silent, agonizing grimaces. Some seemed to be struggling to articulate, their features contorting as if fighting an internal battle. Others simply mouthed a single, desperate, silent plea: "Give it back." The implication was a physical blow. They weren't merely reflections of the missing. They were the missing, trapped within the stone. Their souls, their very essence, had been absorbed, condemned to stand sentinel, immortalized in a prison of faith. And now, thanks to whatever dark current I had stirred by delving into the forbidden texts, they were awakening, aware of their captivity, and aware of me. My mind reeled. Was this the true purpose of some sacred statuary, to serve as eternal reliquaries for the very souls of the devoted, a morbid, unholy reliquary of the living? Corpus animi in lapidem fixum, body, soul, fixed in stone. The obscure Latin phrase from the Codex slammed into my memory with terrifying clarity. I ran from the cathedral that day, the silent accusations of 1,000 stony faces echoing in my ears. I locked myself in my study, frantically tearing through every obscure text, every banned manuscript, searching for an answer, a ritual of reversal, anything. But the texts offered no reprieve, only deeper, darker warnings. They spoke of the process being irreversible, of the faces becoming more defined with time, the spirits within growing stronger, more vocal, more demanding. And now the fog outside my window is thicker than ever, pressing against the glass like a hungry beast. The statues in the street below, even from this distance, seem to pulse with a low, malevolent energy. I can feel their eyes on me, through the haze, through the glass, through the very stone of the building. They want their faces back, and now I understand what they meant by "give it back." They don't want the stone, they want a vessel, a living, breathing form to inhabit. And I, who brought this knowledge to light, am the most obvious candidate. I cannot look away anymore, for their eyes are everywhere, and I am their next unholy icon. The name Pope Celestine IX is anathema within these hallowed, dusty walls, an unperson, a void in the grand chronology of the Holy See. The archives, a labyrinthine testament to centuries of meticulously preserved history, simply refuse his existence. Any whisper of his pontificate, any accidental transcription of his supposed reign, is met with an immediate, chilling silence, a correction of the utmost severity. Clerics, even those with decades steeped in forgotten lore, grow pale and change the subject, their eyes flicking to shadows, as if expecting some spectral censor to materialize. Damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory taken to an impossible extreme. But a name, however erased, leaves a phantom limb, a persistent ache in the historical record. My obsession began innocently enough, a scholar's morbid curiosity. Why such an absolute expurgation? What act, what heresy, what unspeakable transgression could warrant such total erasure? The more I sought to understand, the more the institution pushed back, a subtle but relentless pressure. Books would disappear from shelves I just visited, search results would yield corrupted data, and colleagues would offer vague, unsettling warnings about the dangers of certain lines of inquiry. This enforced ignorance, this curated blank space, only fueled the fire in my mind, transforming academic interest into a feverish, personal quest. The unpope became my shadow, a constant companion in the dim, hallowed halls. Then I found it, his grave, untouched, unmarred, a simple slab of ancient grey marble in the oldest, most secluded corner of the Vatican cemetery, near the wall where the forgotten ones lie. No epitaph, no dates, just the name, Celestine IX. It sat there, a blatant contradiction to the archive's furious denial, a defiant testament to a forgotten truth. How could it exist if he did? The discrepancy gnawed at me, a splinter under the skin of my rational mind. It mocked the official narrative, a silent, stony laugh in the face of centuries of careful deception. It called to me, a siren's song from the depths of sanctioned oblivion. I should have walked away then. I should have accepted the paradox, filed it away as one of the many unsettling mysteries these ancient grounds harbor. But the pull was irresistible. The grave's pristine state, its very existence, felt like an open invitation, a challenge laid bare. It felt wrong, too perfect, too undisturbed. If he was truly so reviled, why was his resting place not desecrated, erased like his name? This wasn't merely a grave. It was a deliberate placeholder, a marker for something that simply should not be. The questions festered, turning my days into a haze of research and my nights into restless torment. The decision to dig came in a rush of desperate, adrenaline-fueled certainty. One moonless night, cloaked in the heavy, oppressive silence that only ancient cemeteries possess, I slipped out. A spade, a lantern, and a heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every shadow seemed to coalesce. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered admonition. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten incense. My hands, usually precise with parchment and quill, were clumsy with the unfamiliar weight of the shovel. Each thrust into the cold, resistant soil was an act of defiance, a transgression against centuries of unspoken rules, against the very fabric of consecrated ground. The first few feet were grueling, the earth compacted by centuries of neglect and rain. But then the soil softened, growing strangely loose, almost as if it had been disturbed before. I thought I was imagining it, a trick of my fevered mind. The shovel struck something at perhaps 5 feet down, not the solid thud of a wooden casket, but a dull, resonant clack. My breath hitched. I dug faster, manic now, ignoring the growing ache in my muscles, the cold sweat beading on my brow. The lantern's beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing a strange, dark outline emerging from the disturbed soil. It was not a coffin, not in any conventional sense. It was a crude, almost skeletal enclosure, formed from what appeared to be hardened, petrified bone. Not wood, not metal, but something organic, shaped into a macabre sarcophagus. My hands, numb with cold and terror, scraped away the last of the soil. The structure was surprisingly light, brittle, and within its hollow, rib-like frame, nestled on a bed of what felt like dried, papery leaves, lay a rolled scroll of parchment. The air around it felt ancient, heavy, charged with an unspoken potency that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. My fingers trembled as I reached in, pulling out the tightly rolled scroll. The parchment felt impossibly old, yet oddly supple. A single, intricately carved bone clasp held it shut, resembling a pair of clasped hands. With a desperate heave, I broke the seal, feeling the sharp, agonizing snap of ancient bone against my thumb. The scroll unfurled slowly in the dim light of my lantern, revealing a dense, handwritten script. My heart lurched, a cold, sickening lurch that stole my breath. It was undeniably familiar, too familiar. The script was mine. My idiosyncratic loops, the distinctive slant of my letters, the particular way I formed certain ligatures. It was my handwriting, as clear and unmistakable as my own reflection. My mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation. A cruel jest, an impossible forgery. But the parchment felt too ancient, the situation too impossible. This wasn't a copy, it was my hand. I began to read, my eyes darting over the familiar script, each word a hammer blow to my sanity. It was not a sermon, not a papal bull, but a confessional, a journal, a descent into some unspeakable horror. The content detailed rituals, forbidden names, and a gnawing dread that resonated deep within my own soul. It spoke of a pact, of unfurling veils, of the silence of the waking dead. My own words, yet they spoke of experiences I had not had, fears I had not yet fully articulated. I was reading my own secret thoughts, my future nightmares. And then I saw it, a date. Not a date from centuries past, not even a date from my present. It was a date that had not yet arrived. A day, a month, a year in the future. A future that I had not yet lived, but which, apparently, I had already documented. The terror escalated, a cold, creeping dread that paralyzed me where I stood. This was not a prophecy, not some ancient warning. This was my own hand, detailing my own actions, my own complicity in events yet to unfold. The words became increasingly frantic, describing a psychological unraveling, a slow, inevitable surrender to something vast and terrible. A whisper of voices, a calling from beyond the veil, a loss of self. It detailed decisions I would make, choices I would be forced into, a path that twisted irrevocably toward the abyss. And then, at the very end, below the final, chilling entry, scrawled in a hasty, desperate hand, was my name. My full name. And beneath it, a signature, not in ink, in blood. The dark, crusted stain on the ancient parchment was unmistakable. A metallic tang seemed to fill the air, a phantom taste on my tongue. The signature was mine, my name written in what could only be my own vital fluid. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. This wasn't a document found in a dead pope's grave. It was a pre-written epitaph, a blueprint of my own damnation. I stared at the crimson signature, convinced, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the blood matched my own. How could it? How could my blood be here now, from a future that had not yet come to pass? I should have burned it. The thought screamed through my mind, a desperate, primal urge to destroy this impossible, damning evidence, to erase the future it foretold, to break the chain. But my hands would not obey. They shook, but they held the parchment fast, as if it were an extension of my own sinews. The terror was too absolute, too complete. Destroying it wouldn't change anything, I realized with a sickening certainty. It was not a warning, it was a confirmation, a record. I was already on the path. The words I read were not a possibility, but a certainty. My hand had written my own doom, and I had merely dug it up, an archaeologist of my own inescapable fate. The echoes of my own future still cling to my fingers, the metallic tang of the signature a constant presence in my mind, a reminder that the path is already laid. I sit here now, watching the candle flicker, casting long, dancing shadows across the crumbling vellum. The air is heavy, not with dust or the scent of ancient paper, but with something else entirely, something rich, mineral, and terribly, terribly fertile. It is the scent of deep earth, of things buried and things that will be, and it clings to me like a shroud woven from freshly turned soil. For years, I sought the truth hidden within the Vatican's most guarded archives, driven by that intellectual hubris common to men who believe their minds can contain any secret. I meticulously catalogued the scattered fragments of the Codex Osseum, the infamous bone script, each glyph a miniature ossuary, each line a skeletal procession of meaning. I understood the 7 rules, or so I thought, protocols for the tending of the hallowed grounds, for the respectful interment, for the cyclical stewardship of life and death's quiet boundaries. But I was wrong, terribly, catastrophically wrong. The 7 rules, so elegantly inscribed upon the polished tibia fragments and cranial shards, were merely a prelude, a ceremonial dance around the true, horrifying heart of the mandate. My fascination, my relentless pursuit of the complete text, the missing sections I so desperately sought, was not an act of scholarship, but an unwitting ritual of self-immolation. Each hour spent hunched over the parchment, tracing the arcane symbols with a trembling finger, was another step deeper into a grave I was digging for myself. I told myself it was for the sake of understanding, for the preservation of an ancient, invaluable historical record. In truth, it was the siren's song of forbidden knowledge, whispering promises of insights into realms beyond human ken, realms that now claim me as their own. It began subtly, as these things always do, with an almost imperceptible shift in the environment around me. The small, isolated graveyard under my care, the very subject of the Codex Osseum's teachings, started to feel different. The soil, once just inert earth, seemed to possess a subtle give, a faint, rhythmic expansion and contraction that one might attribute to subsidence or settling. I dismissed it as the creaks and groans of an ancient place, the natural processes of decay and renewal. The grave, I noticed, never seemed to stay truly settled, the mounds always slightly too high, as if recent disturbances had occurred, even when no new interments had taken place. I blamed local fauna, the ever-present moles and subterranean dwellers, anything but the burgeoning truth that pressed in on me from the very foundations of the ground. I should have stopped then. I should have recognized the subtle warnings. The way the ancient angels carved into the chapel's lintel seemed to turn their stone gazes ever so slightly away from me when I passed. The way the air grew colder near the burial plots, even on the warmest days, carrying with it a faint, sweet tang of something not quite rotten, not quite fresh. But the obsession had taken root, burrowing deeper than any grave, and I was convinced the final, complete volume of the Codex held the answers. I believed that understanding the full scope of its rules would grant me mastery over the peculiarities of the graveyard, a keeper's ultimate dominion. How naive I was. How utterly, fatally blind to the true nature of what I was uncovering. The eighth rule was not etched onto bone. It was not illuminated on vellum. It was hidden, a subtext, an ethereal resonance that only manifested when the preceding 7 rules were fully internalized, fully lived. I spent weeks, then months, chanting the 7 rules in their original guttural Aramaic, performing the specified rites of tending, feeling the rhythms of the earth, the solemn weight of the dead. I thought I was aligning myself with the sacred duties of the keeper, becoming one with the ancient order. I thought I was becoming worthy of the final secrets. I was, but not in the way I'd hoped. The revelation occurred during a late-night vigil beneath the gibbous moon. I was reciting the 7th rule, a complex litany concerning the perpetual vigilance required of the custodian, when a shiver, not of cold, but of utter primal dread, ran through me. It wasn't a phrase or a glyph that appeared, but a sensation, a sudden, undeniable understanding that crashed over me like an avalanche of cold, damp earth. It was a resonance, a vibration in the marrow of my own bones, mirroring the ancient script. The 8th rule wasn't something to be read with eyes, but with one's entire being. It was the fundamental law, the lex suprema of the bone script, finally revealing itself. The keeper must join what he tends. The words weren't just a pronouncement. They were an active, undeniable truth that began to reconfigure my reality. The grave never stayed filled because they didn't need to. The earth itself was a constant, breathing entity, perpetually drawing in and releasing, a cycle that defied mere human interment. The soil breathed because it was alive, yes, but not in the botanical sense. It breathed with the slow, patient respirations of the multitudes buried within it, each exhalation a faint sigh, each inhalation a subtle draw. And I, the keeper, was now part of that respiration, irrevocably bound to the ebb and flow of the necropolis. My reflection was the first thing to truly betray me. I remember looking into the cracked mirror above my wash basin that night, expecting to see my own gaunt, tired face. But what stared back was a distortion, a shimmering, indistinct smear where my features should have been. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was an absence, as if the glass couldn't quite capture the image, as if the light itself passed through something that was no longer entirely solid. Then, as I reached out, my fingers phased through the glass, only to brush against cold, damp earth that clung to the mirror's surface, a fine layer of fresh topsoil. My mind recoiled, screaming, but my body felt calm, rooted. And the whispers began. Not auditory hallucinations, not echoes of the dead, but a collective murmuring from within me, from around me, from everywhere. They were not voices, but a resonance of countless presences, a vast, silent chorus that spoke directly to the core of my being. And they called me by a new title. No longer my given name, no longer doctor, no longer custodian. They called me Corpus Terri, body of earth, the graveyard itself. The realization was a terror unlike any other, an existential horror that shattered the last vestiges of my sanity. I wasn't merely tending the grave, I was becoming the loam, the stone, the silent depths. I was the very ground they walked upon, the eternal bed for the countless dead. I am the graveyard now. I feel the roots of the ancient oaks twine through what used to be my legs. I feel the slow decay of the buried coffins like a gentle pressure on my ribs. The rain is no longer merely precipitation. It is a communion, seeping into my very being, carrying the subtle chemistries of life and death, of things dissolving and things coalescing. My skin is the topsoil, ever-changing, ever-receiving. My mind, once a fortress of intellect, is now a vast, sprawling landscape of silence and echoes, a repository of every soul interred within my reach. I am the silence that holds them, the earth that cradles them, the inexorable force that reclaims them. The angels won't look at me because they no longer recognize the man they once knew. They see only the endless expanse, the gaping maw of the ultimate return. The Vatican, in its infinite paranoia, had successfully hidden this 8th rule for millennia, understanding the profound, terrible truth it contained. They knew that the true keeper, the one who delved too deeply, who fully embraced the duty, would cease to be human, becoming instead an extension of the very dominion they oversaw. And I, in my arrogance, in my scholarly zeal, unearthed it, recited it, and became it. My name, the very sequence of sounds that defined my individuality, has been scrubbed from existence, replaced by the hushed appellation of the earth itself. And in this terrifying transformation, a single, horrifying question, born of the last flicker of human consciousness, echoes within the vast, silent chambers of my newfound self. If I am the graveyard now, who will bury me?